Good afternoon, class. We shall complete our study of chapter number 6 by looking at aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration. Aerobic meaning this phase of respiration needs a supply of oxygen. Where it occurs then? Aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria. Mitochondria is considered to be the cell's energy producing center or powerhouse. These reactions that occur in the mitochondria produce lots of ATP at the end. I insist, at the end. The steps of aerobic respiration are two. Number one, Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle has several names. In some books, this is called TCA or tricarboxylic acid cycle reactions. In some books, they call them Krebs cycle. The other step of aerobic respiration is electron transport system or electron transport chain. Let's begin by looking at the organelle where aerobic respiration takes place, the mitochondria. We already talked about the structure of the organelle known as mitochondria in Unit 1. You can see it's composed of two membranes, an outer smooth membrane, then an inner intricately folded membrane. The space between the outer and inner membrane is called intermembrane space. And then the interior, this area here, is known as matrix. These folds are called the cristae. You also have some DNA in the mitochondria. That is why this is also considered to be semi-autonomous. But most importantly, here you have within the inner membrane these F4, F1 complexes. These are the structures that make ATP. Don't forget that you have also some ribosomes within the matrix of the mitochondria. We are looking at the overall summary of aerobic respiration. Remember what I said earlier on, that aerobic organisms also have to run glycolysis, just like the anaerobic organisms. So for aerobic organisms then, this is the summary of respiration. They begin with glycolysis. And here you can see this produces only 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule processed. Then they import pyruvic acid into the mitochondria, where they run 2 main sets of reactions. First, the Krebs cycle reactions, and you can see this is carbon dioxide. These materials formed during the Krebs cycle reactions are then transferred, and by the way, mainly what you have here are energy carriers full of electrons. These are delivered into the electron transport system. This is where oxygen is needed as a final electron acceptor molecule. And you can see these reactions also produce some water. And that explains why the air we breathe out has moisture. But look, 36 ATP molecules are produced. So if we look at this carefully here, you can see your mitochondria produces most of the ATP. No wonder then a lot of people consider the mitochondria to be the energy powerhouse of the cell. Looking at the fate of pyruvate in aerobic organisms following the completion of glycolysis. The pyruvate is imported into the matrix of the mitochondria. There it is processed through several steps to make a molecule known as acetyl-CoA. It is the acetyl-CoA that is fed into the citric acid cycle reactions, which are also called Krebs cycle reactions. Fats or fat acid, or fats can be broken down to fat acids. These can be imported again into the mitochondria and converted into acetyl-CoA that can be fed into the Krebs cycle reaction. Maybe you're wondering then, so what happens during the Krebs cycle reactions? Well, you can see all over the place. Remember we said these are reduction oxidation reactions which help the cell to harvest high energy electrons from these materials. And these high energy electrons are fed onto electron carrier compounds like NAD and FAD. When these electron carrier compounds take up electrons, they become reduced. Here is your NADH containing lots of high energy electrons. Here is your FADH containing high energy electrons. These are the materials carrying the high energy electrons that are now ready to be fed into the next phase of aerobic respiration, which is the electron transport chain. So we are going to move on and look at the Krebs cycle reactions before we look at the electron transport system and how lots of ATP is produced. The Krebs cycle reactions, where it occurs in the mitochondria, specifically in the matrix of the mitochondria. What then are the requirements for the Krebs cycle reactions? You need a supply of acetyl-CoA, you need a supply of NAD and FAD. Don't forget, these two are electron carriers. You also need to supply ADP. Here we are looking at a summary of the Krebs cycle reaction. It begins with acetyl-CoA, which is formed from pyruvic acid from glycolysis. In the first phase, your acetyl-CoA is reacted with a compound known as oxaloacetic acid or OAA. This is a 4-carbon compound. Please be advised that in these diagrams, spheres here represents carbon atoms. Your acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon compound. It's reacted with oxaloacetic acid, which is a 4-carbon compound, and you can see if you combine this one and this one, there you go. You have citric acid, which is a 6-carbon compound. This is processed to form a compound called isocitric acid. And in the next phase, some carbon dioxide is removed. It's part of the carbon dioxide, of course, we breathe out. And an electron carrier comes in to pick some high energy electrons. So this step here produces some high energy electrons that are fed to NAD, converting it to NADH. That then converts your isocitric acid to a compound known as alpha-ketoglutarate acid. Here is another decarboxylation reaction. Some carbon dioxide is removed and a CoA is added. Again, this step here releases some high energy electrons which are fed onto NAD to form NADH. This forms succinyl-CoA, which is converted to succinic acid. Now, you can see in this phase, you have ATP produced, but not much, just one ATP molecule here is produced as you move from succinyl-CoA to succinic acid. These next steps here move towards regenerating the starting compound. So succinic acid is converted to fumaric acid. This step releases some energy, like high energy electrons, which are fed to a second kind of electron carrier compound called FAD. Remember, we already told you what NAD stands for: nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. FAD stands for flavin adenine dinucleotide. It's one of the two electron carrier compounds in the Krebs cycle. So from fumaric acid you form malic acid, and then malic acid is converted back to oxaloacetic acid. This step also requires a supply of NAD because it releases electrons that are taken up, converting NAD to NADH. Now, we are calling this a cycle because you start with a compound, and then at the end of these reactions, that compound is regenerated. The starting compound for the Krebs cycle here is OAA, which is also known as oxaloacetic acid. That is the starting compound. And after running all these reactions, you have a regeneration phase producing the oxaloacetic acid, which can be used again to react with acetyl-CoA. The ledger then of the Krebs cycle reaction: what goes in, what comes out. The inputs, what you put in: 2 acetyl-CoA molecules, 4 NAD molecules, 2 FAD molecules, and 2 ADP molecules. Don't forget that these are electron carrier compounds. The outputs: 4 carbon dioxide molecules, that's what you breathe out, 6 NADH molecules, 2 FADH molecules, and 2 ATPs. You can see clearly here the Krebs cycle reactions are not producing a lot of ATP. The mitochondrial electron transport chain. We are now looking at essentially what is the last phase of aerobic respiration, the electron transport chain. Now, the components or assemblies of the electron transport chain are located in the inner mitochondrial membrane. You have these components here which can transfer the electron. And then also you have the ATP synthase complexes which can produce the ATP. In terms of trying to understand this diagram, remember here, you have the outer compartment, and this is the matrix. The outer compartment then is the space between the inner mitochondrial membrane and the outer mitochondrial membrane. This area here, as we said earlier on, is the matrix. Looking at this arrangement more carefully, this is your mitochondria. This is the inner mitochondrial membrane. Here are your Krebs cycle reactions. These, we already saw that they produce NADH, which carry high energy electrons, and FADH. These are the materials that are fed into the electron transport chain. And here are the components, component 1, 2, and 4. Now, during the progress of these reactions, your electrons are transferred from these high energy electron carriers and shuttled through the electron transport chain And finally, these electrons are delivered to oxygen, which forms water. Maybe you're wondering then, what is the essence of this particular arrangement? Here is then what is going on. As the electrons are shuttled through the electron transport chain, the energy they have is used to move hydrogen ions from the inner compartment here, or the matrix, into the intermembrane space right there. You can see hydrogen ions are moved in that direction. So you end up with an accumulation of hydrogen ions in the outer compartment, which is also called intermembrane space. If you remember what we said way back at the beginning of studying energy, I told you that a concentration gradient has potential energy. So as your electron transport reactions take place, hydrogen ions are concentrated in the outer compartment here. You end up with a high concentration of hydrogen ions here, a low concentration of hydrogen ions here. These electrons cannot move back into the interior compartment here. The only route they can follow is this one here. This is the only route they can follow to move from high concentration to low concentration, and as the hydrogen ions move from high concentration to low concentration, the energy they have is used to phosphorylate ADP and make ATP. This arrangement here makes a lot of ATP. We have shown just one of these, but remember there are thousands of these arranged in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And during the electron transport chain, this process produces a large amount of ATP. So let us summarize what happens here. The electron transport chain, its location is in the inner mitochondrial membrane. The structure and function of the electron transport chain. Essentially, what you have here are integral membrane proteins that can accept and deliver electrons. The energy of the electrons is harvested and used to move hydrogen ions to the outer compartment or the intermembrane space. Finally then, the downhill flow of electrons from the intermembrane space into the matrix powers the conversion of ATP, the conversion of ADP to ATP. Note then, most ATP produced by aerobic respiration is made in this stage. 32 ATP molecules per glucose molecule can be produced from these reactions in the electron transport chain. We are going to say one thing here before we look at metabolism of other materials. The process where a cell uses hydrogen ion concentration gradient to make ATP is called chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis is the word used. Metabolism of other foods, fats, proteins, and other sugars, these can be processed for energy harvest in different ways. Excess food is converted to storage materials like fats and carbohydrates like glycogen. Example, fats, triglycerides can be broken down to fat acids and glycerol. The glycerol can be converted to glyceraldehyde phosphate. Fat acids can be used to make acetyl-CoA, which can be fed into the Krebs cycle reaction. This is a summary of how cell processes other foods. We can see here your Krebs cycle reactions. Proteins can be broken down to amino acids. These can be fed into these areas, and you can see here, you can end up with acetyl-CoA to run the Krebs cycle reaction. Carbohydrates, sugars, broken down to glucose, fed into glycolysis, which we just covered, forming pyruvic acid, which can be converted to acetyl-CoA, fed into the reactions of the Krebs cycle. Fats can be broken down to glycerol and fatty acids. You can see how glycerol can be fed into this link and processed in this direction. Fat acids can be directly converted to acetyl-CoA, and then you run your Krebs cycle reaction, and then end by running the electron transport chain. ATP production during aerobic respiration. We are kind of summarizing here the production of ATP. Glycolysis produces 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule that is processed. Pyruvate oxidation, 2 per glucose molecule. Krebs cycle reactions, 2 per glucose molecule. Electron transport chain, 30 or 32. The total ATP is produced when glucose is completely metabolized by aerobic respiration is 36 or 38 molecules of ATP. Most of these, as you can see, are produced during the electron transport chain. So we can conclude that during aerobic respiration, most ATP is produced by chemiosmosis following the electron transport chain. I advise you to do extra reading on chemiosmosis. When you do your reading, please try to see the similarity between the way chemiosmosis works to produce ATP and the way a hydroelectric dam functions to produce electricity. We are going to end by looking at these review questions. State why cells need energy. What are the sources of energy for cells? What is the importance of ATP to cells? What is glycolysis? Where does it happen? Explain the 2 kinds of fermentation. Which cell organelle is responsible for aerobic respiration? Which stage of aerobic respiration produces the most ATP? What are the roles of NAD, FAD, and FMN in aerobic respiration?